Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a history lesson that's less about heroic battles and more about, well, avoiding a truly dreadful end. Imagine, for a moment, that it's the mid-14th century. You're not scrolling through TikTok, you're just existing. The air isn't filled with Wi-Fi signals. It's thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, burning refuse, and something else, a faint, sickly sweet odor that, if you knew what it meant, would send shivers down your spine. This isn't a zombie apocalypse movie. This is your everyday, run-of-the-mill medieval Tuesday. And guess what? A tiny, unseen enemy is about to make its grand entrance. You probably won't survive this. Most people didn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a bustling port city, perhaps Messina, Sicily, in October of 1347. The salty breeze carries the cries of gulls and the rhythmic creak of wooden ships. You're just another face in the crowd, trying to eke out a living. Perhaps you're a dock worker, hauling heavy sacks, or a street vendor, hawking lukewarm ale. Life is hard, sure, but it's familiar. Then, the ships arrive. Not just any ships, but Genoese trading vessels, fresh from the Black Sea. They're laden with exotic goods, but also with something far more sinister. The crews are sick, many already dead, their bodies covered in grotesque swellings. This is your first glimpse of the Black Death, though you don't call it that yet. You just call it a bad omen, a mysterious sickness that seems to drain the life right out of a person. Your first instinct, if you're smart and a little lucky, might be to run. To flee the city, to escape the putrid air and the growing piles of corpses. But where do you go? And who would let you in? The concept of quarantine is barely forming, crude, and often brutal. Some cities, like Milan, actually bricked up the doors of houses where the sick were found, sealing entire families inside to die. Imagine that. One cough, one fever, and suddenly your front door becomes your tombstone. It's a rather extreme form of social distancing, wouldn't you say? Historians still argue whether these draconian measures were truly effective or simply served as a public spectacle of despair. You might try to avoid anyone who looks ill, clutching a perfumed handkerchief to your nose, convinced that the bad air, the miasma, is the real culprit. This belief was widespread. People thought the disease spread through foul smells, which, while intuitively logical given the stench of death, completely missed the actual microscopic villains at play. So, you're diligently holding your breath around open sewers, but happily shaking hands with a fellow merchant who just sneezed into his palm. Oops. The official response is often a mixture of prayer, panic, and pitiful attempts at medical intervention. Priests lead solemn processions, begging for divine mercy, while flagellants whip themselves publicly, believing that self-punishment will appease an angry God. You might join them, feeling a desperate need for some control, some explanation for the terror gripping your world. Meanwhile, doctors, often learned but largely ignorant of true pathology, prescribe strange remedies, potent laxatives to purge the body or bleeding to balance the humors. You might be told to rub onions, herbs, or even a live chicken on your bubo swollen, painful lymph nodes that are the telltale sign of the plague. And yes, people actually try the chicken thing. Apparently, the chicken was supposed to draw out the disease. It probably just got a very unpleasant bath. You begin to notice the subtle shifts in your daily life. The markets are less crowded, the usual chatter replaced by a fearful quiet. Fewer ships arrive, and those that do are treated with suspicion. The price of food starts to climb, not because of scarcity initially, but because fear keeps people from their usual trades. The fabric of society, which seems so robust, so eternal, feels like it's unraveling thread by thread. You see friends, neighbors, even family members succumb within days, sometimes hours. The sheer speed of the illness is terrifying. One morning they are hale, the next they are feverish, and by nightfall, they are gone, their bodies often left in the street because there's no one left to bury them. The fear isn't just about dying. It's about dying alone, unmourned, and unburied. As the plague tightened its grip, your daily life, already precarious, became a constant negotiation with invisible threats and very visible filth. Let's talk about hygiene, or more accurately, the distinct lack thereof. You're living in a world where personal cleanliness is, let's just say, a low priority item on the medieval to-do list. Forget your morning shower, your carefully chosen skincare routine, or even just a good scrub with soap. Soap, as you know it, is a luxury if it exists at all, and regular bathing, that's reserved for the truly wealthy, and even then, it's more of a communal dip in often murky water. You probably wear the same clothes for days, weeks even, unless you're lucky enough to have multiple sets. And when they get dirty, you don't exactly pop them into a washing machine. You might beat them against a rock in a nearby stream, or simply let the grime accumulate. Your street is not paved with gold or even cobblestones, but with, well, let's just call it organic material. Human and animal waste, discarded food scraps, industrial effluviate all gets tossed right out the door or into open gutters. Imagine the stench on a hot summer day. It's not just unpleasant, it's a breeding ground. Rats, fleas, and flies are your constant companions, scurrying through the refuse, nesting in the thatch of your roof, and feasting on anything edible, or even inedible, they can find. These aren't just minor annoyances, they're the unwitting couriers of death. You might swat at a fly buzzing around your face, completely unaware that it could be carrying the very bacteria that will plunge you into fever. Even your drinking water is suspect. You might draw it from a communal well, which, while perhaps fresher than a river, is still susceptible to contamination from surface runoff or shallow graves. Or you drink from the river itself, downstream from where refuse is dumped and laundry is washed. Boiling water isn't a standard practice for safety. It's done for cooking or brewing, which, speaking of brewing, is why so many people drank ale or weak beer throughout the day. It wasn't just for fun. It was often safer than the available water, as the fermentation process killed off some of the nasties. So, ironically, your daily pint might have been one of your better preventative measures, though certainly not a miracle cure. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of weak alcoholic beverages truly mitigated disease spread or merely offered a false sense of security. When you do get sick, your bed isn't some pristine, sanitized haven. It's likely a straw mattress, shared with family members, and rarely, if ever, cleaned or aired out. Fleas, the true vectors of the plague, would be having an absolute field day, hopping from person to person, biting and transmitting the deadly Yersinia pestis bacterium with every feast. You might wake up with itchy bites, dismissing them as the usual discomforts of medieval life, never connecting them to the terrifying swellings that appear days later. You don't have bug spray or even a basic understanding of how insects transmit disease. Your primary defense against them is probably just scratching and hoping they go away. Personal hygiene rituals, if they exist, are often based on tradition or superstition rather than scientific understanding. You might rinse your mouth with wine to sweeten your breath, or rub your teeth with a rough cloth. You might even use a mixture of ashes and vinegar to wash your hands, if you're particularly fastidious. But these are superficial gestures in a world teeming with microscopic life, both harmless and deadly. The very air you breathe, the ground you walk on, the clothes you wear all are ripe with the potential for infection. You might think you're being careful by avoiding sick people, but the lack of basic sanitation means the enemy is everywhere, patiently waiting for its opportunity. It's like trying to avoid rain in a hurricane when you don't even know what an umbrella is. With the specter of disease looming, your concerns would quickly shift to the most basic of needs, food. Dietary choices in the medieval era weren't exactly about organic, farm-to-table freshness. You were largely at the mercy of the seasons, local agriculture, and the unpredictable whims of nature. Forget varied food groups or balanced nutrition. Your diet was, by modern standards, incredibly monotonous and often deficient, a factor that profoundly impacted your body's ability to resist illness. If you were a peasant, your staple would be grain. You'd consume vast quantities of bread, often a coarse, dark loaf made from rye or barley, baked in communal ovens. This bread wasn't just a side dish. It was the meal, often accounting for 70 to 80% of your caloric intake. Imagine eating a dense, often stale, piece of bread for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day in and day out. Vegetables will be limited to what could be grown locally and what was in season: cabbages, onions, leeks, and perhaps some root vegetables like carrots or parsnips. Fresh fruit was a rare treat, mostly eaten straight from the tree or bush during its brief season before spoiling. Preservation methods were rudimentary, relying on salting, drying, or pickling, which further limited variety and nutrient content. You certainly wouldn't be popping a multivitamin with your morning gruel. Meat was a luxury, primarily reserved for special occasions or the tables of the wealthy. If you were lucky, you might get some salted pork or dried fish, but fresh meat was rare. What meat you did get might be from livestock that wandered freely, sometimes leading to rather unappetizing culinary surprises. Historians still argue whether the general lack of protein in the common person's diet significantly worsened the plague's mortality rates, weakening immune systems already under stress. You might occasionally catch a rabbit or some birds or forage for wild berries and nuts, but these were supplementary, not foundational, to your diet. As the plague took hold, access to even these basic foodstuffs became erratic. Farmers died in the fields, harvests rotted, and trade routes ground to a halt. The simple act of going to the market became a terrifying gamble, exposing you to infected crowds. Food prices would soar, putting even meager supplies out of reach for many. You'd witness widespread famine, not just from crop failures, but from the complete breakdown of social and economic structures. Imagine scrounging for scraps, your stomach gnawing with hunger, while the very air seems to hum with death. It's a pretty effective appetite suppressant, actually. Your medieval gut flora would be a wild, untamed ecosystem, certainly not the carefully curated balance promoted by today's probiotics. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat. You'd likely be eating things that, by modern standards, would send you straight to the emergency room with food poisoning. But your body, through generations of exposure, had developed a certain resilience, a grim tolerance for bacterial roulette. Still, chronic low-level infections from contaminated food and water would constantly tax your immune system, leaving it ill-equipped to face a foe as formidable as the plague. And then there's the psychological impact of constant hunger. It's not just a physical discomfort. It's a grinding, pervasive anxiety that slowly erodes your spirit. Every decision becomes about caloric intake and survival. You might find yourself envious of a neighbor's scrawny chicken, dreaming of a meal that isn't just another bowl of watery pottage. This chronic malnutrition wasn't merely uncomfortable. It directly compromised your body's ability to fight off any infection, let alone one as devastating as the Black Death. You were essentially starting the fight with one arm tied behind your back, and frankly, a rumbling stomach. When the Black Death arrived, the prevailing medical knowledge or lack thereof was truly a major hurdle to your survival. Forget antibiotics, sterile environments, or even a basic understanding of germ theory. You're in an era where medicine is a confusing blend of ancient Greek theories, astrology, superstition, and a healthy dose of wishful thinking. The primary medical concept was the theory of humors, which proposed that the human body was composed of 4 basic substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors, and the cure involved restoring that balance. It's like trying to fix a complex engine by adjusting the levels of its various fluids, completely unaware of the pistons or spark plugs. So if you fell ill with the plague, exhibiting its terrifying symptoms: fever, chills, agonizing buboes, those swollen lymph nodes, and dark blotches on your skin, a medieval physician would likely prescribe bloodletting. This involved cutting a vein or applying leeches to drain what was believed to be bad blood that was causing the imbalance. Imagine You're already weakened by disease, and someone is deliberately taking more blood from you. It's the medical equivalent of trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. While some historians argue that very careful, minimal bloodletting might have, in rare cases, offered some temporary relief from fever, its widespread and often excessive application undoubtedly weakened patients further, making them more susceptible to the disease's ravages. Beyond bloodletting, there's a whole host of other bizarre and often painful remedies. You might be given strong purges and emetics to induce vomiting and diarrhea, believed to expel the noxious humors or the bad air from your body. Think about it. Severe dehydration on top of a raging infection. Not exactly a recipe for recovery. You might be told to inhale strong-smelling herbs, spices, or even vinegar, based on the miasma theory that the disease was carried by foul odors. You'd walk around with a Pomandra perforated container holding aromatic substances clutched to your nose, hoping the pleasant smell would somehow ward off the unseen killer. It certainly made you smell better than your unwashed neighbors, but it did absolutely nothing to stop fleas. Quirky tidbits abound in this medical landscape. For instance, yes, emeralds. Because clearly, if it's expensive, it must be effective, right? Other cures included spreading a plaster of human excrement and herbs on the swellings, or having a live pigeon cut open and applied to the bubo, supposedly to draw out the poison. The sheer desperation is palpable in these practices. Historians still debate whether any of these folk remedies or official medical practices had even a placebo effect, or if they merely highlighted the profound helplessness of the era. The physicians themselves, though educated, were operating with a fundamental lack of understanding of disease. They wore strange costumes, later famously depicted as bird-like masks with long beaks filled with aromatic herbs, though this iconic plague doctor image is actually from much later epidemics, not the 14th century. Still, the underlying sentiment of attempting to protect oneself from miasma was very much present. They relied on observation, astrological charts, and the limited texts available to them, often written centuries prior. The idea of microscopic organisms causing disease was utterly alien. So, when you presented with a fever and swollen glands, the doctor might consult the alignment of the stars, rather than, say, asking if you'd recently been bitten by a flea. It's a miracle anyone survived their treatment, let alone the plague itself. Your best chance, often, was simply having a robust immune system and getting lucky enough not to be bitten by an infected flea in the first place. As the terrifying reality of the plague set in, communities desperately tried to protect themselves, often resorting to drastic isolation tactics. You'd witness towns and cities attempting to wall themselves off, creating self-imposed fortresses against the invisible enemy. Imagine the chaos. Gates being barred, watchmen posted, and anyone attempting to enter from infected area being turned away, sometimes violently. It was a harsh, often inhumane, but understandable reaction to an existential threat. If you were outside the walls when they closed, you were simply out of luck, left to fend for yourself in the countryside. The concept of quarantine, derived from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, began to take shape, though its implementation was haphazard and brutal. Ships arriving from plague-stricken ports were often forced to anchor offshore for a prescribed period, initially 30 days, later extended to 40 before anyone was allowed to disembark. This was a crude but surprisingly effective measure, giving time for the disease to run its course among the crew or passengers, ideally preventing its spread to the mainland. You might be one of those unfortunate souls stuck on a ship, watching your fellow travelers sicken and die, knowing that freedom was just beyond reach, but equally aware that going ashore might mean bringing death to your loved ones. It was a grim waiting game, punctuated by the splashes of bodies being committed to the deep. Within cities, if a household was struck by the plague, the authorities might take extreme measures. Doors and windows of infected homes were often boarded up, sealing the sick and their families inside to die. This was meant to contain the contagion, preventing anyone from leaving and spreading the disease. Imagine the horror of hearing the hammers at your door, knowing your fate was sealed. The screams and pleas from within would eventually fade, replaced by a chilling silence. This practice, while undeniably cruel, speaks volumes about the sheer panic and desperation that gripped society. Historians still argue whether such severe isolation tactics truly contained the plague or simply ensured that entire families perished without aid, thereby increasing overall mortality by leaving the sick untended. Beyond official decrees, people resorted to their own forms of self-isolation. If you had the means, you might flee to a secluded country estate, hoping the fresh air and distance from crowded towns would protect you. This was the strategy immortalized in Boccaccio's Decameron, where 10 young people escaped Florence to a villa in the Tuscan hills, passing their time telling stories. Of course, this was a luxury afforded only to the very wealthy. For the vast majority, fleeing was not an option. They were tied to their land or their livelihoods in the infected urban centers. You'd witness the flight of the rich, often leaving behind a desperate, leaderless populace. Even within your own home, you might try to isolate the sick in a separate room, a futile attempt given the prevalence of fleas. You might try to cleanse your house by burning aromatic woods or herbs, believing the smoke would purify the air. The smell of incense and burning juniper would become commonplace, a constant reminder of the unseen enemy. Churches, initially places of refuge and comfort, often became vectors for the disease themselves as desperate parishioners crowded together for solace, inadvertently spreading the very illness they prayed to escape. It was a catch-22. Seek spiritual comfort and risk infection, or stay home and face the terror alone. Now, let's consider your geographical lottery. Will you live whether in a bustling metropolis or a sleepy hamlet played a colossal role in your chances of survival? Urban versus rural. It was the ultimate high-stakes gamble. If you were unlucky enough to reside in a large, thriving city like Florence, London, or Paris, your odds plummeted dramatically. These were the epicenters of trade, culture, and, unfortunately, contagion. Think about the medieval city. It's a hive of activity, constantly buzzing with merchants, artisans, pilgrims, and beggars. Streets are narrow, houses are tightly packed, often leaning over the thoroughfares, creating dark, sunless alleys. Sanitation, as we've discussed, is practically non-existent. People live in close quarters, often multiple families sharing a single dwelling or even a single room. Imagine the proximity. You're practically breathing the same air as your dozens of neighbors, sharing water sources and brushing shoulders with hundreds, if not thousands, of strangers daily. This extreme population density was a dream come true for the plague. A single infected flea or person arriving in port could, and often did, ignite an uncontrollable conflagration of disease. Historians still argue about the precise mortality rates in specific urban centers, but figures often range from 30% to a terrifying 60% or even higher in some places. You'd see entire districts depopulated, houses standing empty, and the silence of death settling over once vibrant marketplaces. It was like living in a very real, very grim horror movie where everyone was an extra. The communal well, the public bathhouse, if one existed, the crowded church, the bustling market square each was a potential death trap. Even simple daily tasks, like buying bread or attending mass, became life-threatening endeavors. The constant movement of people, coupled with the unsanitary conditions, meant that the disease spread like wildfire. One day, your street is lively. A week later, it's a ghost town, punctuated only by the occasional mournful toll of a church bell for the dead. The sheer volume of corpses overwhelmed traditional burial grounds, leading to mass graves, further compounding the unsanitary nightmare. Contrast this with life in a remote rural village. Here, your chances, while still slim, were comparatively better. Population density was significantly lower. Houses were spaced farther apart, and your interactions were primarily with your immediate family and a handful of close neighbors. If the plague arrived, it often did so more slowly, carried by an infected traveler rather than a constant influx of ships and goods. The disease might burn through one family or one cluster of cottages, but due to the isolation, it might not spread to the entire village. You might hear terrifying rumors from the nearest town, tales of mass death and abandonment, but feel a grim sense of relief that your small, isolated community had, so far, been spared. Of course, rural life had its own perils. If the plague did arrive, access to even the rudimentary medical care available in cities was non-existent. You were entirely dependent on local folk remedies, the prayers of a village priest, or simply the strength of your own constitution. And if enough villagers died, the essential work of farming might cease, leading to starvation even for survivors. So, while you might escape the direct clutches of the plague, you could still face a slow, agonizing death from lack of food. It's a bit like choosing between getting hit by a speeding carriage or slowly starving in a ditch. Neither option is particularly appealing, but one offers a slightly better chance of not being immediately flattened. In a world teeming with invisible threats, your daily interactions with animals, both wild and domestic, held surprising sway over your fate during the Black Death. We're not just talking about the obvious culprits here. While rats often get top billing as the plague's primary vectors, the story is a bit more nuanced and, frankly, a bit more furry. Let's start with the undisputed villains, rats and their fleas. You'd encounter rats everywhere. They scurried through the straw of your floors, nested in your walls and roofs, and feasted in your granaries and privies. They were an omnipresent, if unwelcome, part of medieval life. And on these rats, specifically the black rat, Rattus rattus, lived the fleas, the true, tiny, bloodthirsty delivery systems for the Yersinia pestis bacterium. When a rat died from the plague, its hungry fleas would jump to the nearest warm body, which, unfortunately for you, was often your warm body. A single flea bite, barely noticed, could deliver a death sentence. You might try to set traps or keep cats, but the sheer numbers of rats in medieval settlements made such efforts largely futile. Historians still argue whether the arrival of the plague was more closely tied to rat movements along trade routes or to human-to-human transmission once the disease was established. Either way, the rats and their passengers were not your friends. But what about other animals? Your livestock, for instance. Chickens, pigs, cows, sheep, these were vital for sustenance. While they weren't direct carriers of the bubonic plague to humans in the same way rats were, their health was intertwined with yours. A sick animal meant less food, which meant a weaker you, less able to fight off infection. And in some rarer forms of plague, like pneumonic plague, where the disease spread from person to person through respiratory droplets, proximity to livestock in cramped conditions could certainly increase the risk of other infections, further compromising your immune system. You might notice unusual deaths among your animals, a chilling precursor to what was about to sweep through the human population. Then there were the animals often kept as companions, like dogs and cats. Your scruffy mongrel or barn cat wasn't just a pet. It was often a working animal, a rodent catcher, or a guard. While cats did hunt rats, the black rat was nimble and adept at avoiding predators, meaning cats weren't a perfect solution to the plague problem. And both dogs and cats could carry fleas, though they were less efficient vectors for the plague to humans than rat fleas. You might find comfort in the presence of your dog, a familiar creature in a world turned upside down, completely unaware that it too might be harboring the tiny carriers of death. It's a cruel irony. The creatures you rely on for companionship or control could also, unwittingly, be part of the problem. Beyond the direct carriers, think about the general interaction with animals. You might share your living space with them, particularly in rural areas where animals were brought indoors during harsh weather. Their waste contributed to the unsanitary conditions that allowed diseases to flourish. And consider wild animals. While they weren't primary vectors for the urban plague, their movements could occasionally contribute to the spread of disease in more remote areas. A squirrel, a rabbit, or a marmot for instance, could carry plague, and while less likely to interact directly with humans than rats, could still be part of the larger ecological cycle of the disease. You might stumble upon a dead badger in the woods, not realizing its lifeless body could still harbor infected fleas, waiting for their next host. Beyond the invisible microbes and the scurrying vermin, even your choice of fashion and fabrics in the medieval era could subtly impact your vulnerability to the plague. Now, you're probably not thinking about your outfit as a protective shield, but in a world where disease transmission was a mystery, every aspect of daily life held unforeseen consequences. Let's start with the basics of medieval clothing. For most people, particularly the common folk, clothing was made from wool or linen. Wool, while warm and durable, was notoriously difficult to clean. It absorbed sweat, dirt, and odors, and rarely saw proper washing. Linen, made from flax, was somewhat easier to clean, but still far from what we consider hygienic. Imagine wearing the same woolen tunic for weeks, accumulating grime, and, more importantly, providing a cozy, undisturbed habitat for fleas. These tiny insects could burrow into the thick weave of the fabric, settling down for a nice, long meal on your unsuspecting skin. You might scratch at an itch, thinking nothing of it, completely unaware that the source of your discomfort was also the vector for a deadly disease. It's like wearing a personalized, mobile flea market. Underneath your outer garments, you might wear a simple linen shift or chemise. These are slightly more likely to be washed, as they were in direct contact with your skin. But even then, washing involved considerable effort boiling water, harsh lye, and strenuous scrubbing, so it wasn't a daily affair. The concept of changing clothes frequently, let alone showering daily, was practically unheard of for the vast majority of the population. So, you're living in your clothes, sleeping in them, working in them, and essentially creating a continuous, unwashed layer between your skin and the world, a perfect environment for any opportunistic parasites. Now consider the layering. Medieval clothing, especially in cooler climates, involved multiple layers. A tunic, perhaps an outer gown or cloak, leggings, and head coverings were common. While practical for warmth, these layers provided even more nooks and crannies for fleas to hide, making it harder to dislodge them. Your hat, for instance, might be a warm and practical accessory, but it could also be a surprisingly good spot for a flea to hitch a ride, especially if you worked or lived in close proximity to others. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of furs by the wealthy, known carriers of fleas, played a significant role in spreading the disease among the elite. What about protection? Some anecdotal accounts suggest that certain materials were believed to offer protection, though these beliefs were based on superstition rather than science. For instance, wearing silk, a rare and expensive fabric, was thought by some to ward off disease. Of course, silk itself offered no magical immunity, but its smooth texture might have been less appealing to fleas than rough wool. Similarly, carrying or wearing pouches of strong-smelling herbs or dried flowers, known as pomanders or posies, was a common practice, believed to purify the air around you and thus ward off the miasma. You'd clutch one to your nose as you walked through the stench of the streets, hoping the pleasant aroma of lavender or rue would act as an invisible shield. It was a nice thought, but sadly, completely ineffective against actual bacteria. It probably just made you smell marginally better as you succumbed to the plague. Even the simple presence of clothing itself, rather than nakedness, was a factor. While you weren't going around nude, the more exposed your skin, the less surface area there was for fleas to land and bite. But then again, being unclothed in the medieval period carried its own significant risks, not least of which was hypothermia. So, you were stuck between a rock and a hard place, where clothes and harbor fleas, or risk freezing and exposure. Given the choices, most people opted for the flea-friendly wardrobe. In the face of an incomprehensible and unstoppable terror like the Black Death, humanity inevitably turned to its deepest resources, belief systems. For you, a person living in the 14th century, faith wasn't just a Sunday activity. It was the very bedrock of your existence. explaining everything from the rising sun to sudden death. And when the plague struck, the church was both a source of immense comfort and, tragically, sometimes a vector for the disease itself. You'd find yourself seeking solace in prayer, attending Mass with fervent desperation, believing that the plague was a divine punishment for humanity's sins. This was a widespread interpretation. The sheer scale and horror of the epidemic seemed to confirm the idea that God was angry, unleashing his wrath upon a sinful world. Priests would preach sermons filled with fire and brimstone, urging repentance. You might join processions of flagellants, groups of penitents who would whip themselves publicly, believing that such self-punishment would atone for sins and appease God, thereby ending the plague. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of people, stripped to the waist, scourging themselves, blood mixing with sweat and tears, all while the stench of death hung heavy in the air. While these acts provided a sense of agency and shared suffering, they also brought large groups of people into close contact, inadvertently helping the disease spread. Alongside the fervent piety, there was a profound sense of fatalism. If the plague was God's will, then individual effort might seem futile. Why bother with quarantines or remedies if your fate was already sealed? This fatalism could lead to despair, but also, paradoxically, to a kind of reckless abandon. Some people, believing they were doomed anyway, would give themselves over to carousing and indulgence, trying to squeeze every last drop out of life before the inevitable. You might see groups feasting, drinking, and singing in taverns, ignoring all precautions, a macabre danse macabre playing out in real time. Others might turn to extremes of charity, giving away all their possessions, convinced that worldly goods no longer mattered. The official church response was a mixture of spiritual guidance and practical, albeit often ineffective, measures. Bishops ordered special prayers, masses, and processions. They urged people to confess their sins. However, the sheer number of deaths meant that priests themselves were dying at alarming rates, leaving many communities without spiritual guidance or last rites. This loss of clergy added to the profound sense of hopelessness and abandonment. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on divine wrath as the cause of the plague contributed to greater social breakdown or provided a necessary framework for understanding an otherwise inexplicable catastrophe. Superstition also played a significant role. Alongside Christian piety, ancient folk beliefs resurfaced. You might wear amulets or charms, believing they had protective powers. Some people blamed specific groups, leading to horrifying persecutions. For instance, Jewish communities were often scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells, and subjected to horrific violence. This was a dark side of the collective fear and panic, where desperate people sought a tangible explanation and a target for their rage. You might witness such atrocities, or perhaps even be swept up in the hysteria, a chilling reminder of how fear can unravel societal bonds. Ultimately, your belief system provided a framework, however imperfect, for processing unimaginable grief and loss. It offered a promise of salvation in the afterlife, a solace in a world where life was cheap and death was constant. Whether you prayed, flagellated, or simply resigned yourself to fate, your faith was a constant companion in the terrifying journey through the plague years. Just as you tried to navigate daily life within your plague-stricken village or city, the act of travel itself became a terrifying gamble, often a death sentence during the Black Death. Medieval Europe was far from stagnant. People moved for trade, pilgrimage, war, or simply to seek new opportunities. But every journey, every dusty road taken, every ship sailed, became a potential pathway for the unseen killer. Imagine you're a merchant. Your livelihood depends on transporting goods from one town to another. As news of the great mortality spreads, your anxiety levels would skyrocket. Each new town you entered could be a hotbed of infection. You'd encounter fearful villagers who might bar their gates, or desperate refugees fleeing their own plague-ridden homes, unwittingly carrying the disease with them. The roads, once bustling with activity, would grow eerily quiet, or conversely, be choked with panicked travelers, each interaction a roll of the dice. You might try to stay in isolated inns, or even sleep under the stars, avoiding crowded urban centers, but the risk was ever present. This was not a time for leisurely tourism. Every journey was a pilgrimage of peril. Pilgrimages, once a cornerstone of religious life, became incredibly dangerous. Thousands of devout individuals would converge on holy sites, sharing crowded roads, inns, and churches. This mass movement of people from various regions, often carrying fleas in their clothing and bedding, created superspreader events on a scale unimaginable before modern transportation. A pilgrim might leave a healthy village, visit a shrine in a plague-ridden city, and return home, inadvertently carrying death back to their community. Historians still argue over the exact extent to which long-distance pilgrimage contributed to the rapid, continent-wide spread of the initial wave of the plague, versus more localized trade routes. Soldiers on the move were another significant factor. Wars didn't simply cease because of the plague. Armies still marched, laid siege to cities, and brought their own particular brand of chaos and disease. Soldiers, often living in unsanitary conditions and moving frequently, were excellent vectors for transmitting the plague over long distances. Imagine a siege camp, crowded with men, horses, and all the attendant filth, a perfect breeding ground for disease, which then exploded into the surrounding countryside when the troops moved on. It's like a medieval mobile petri dish. The sheer unpredictability of who carried the disease made travel a nerve-wracking experience. You couldn't tell if the kindly traveler offering you water by the roadside was healthy or incubating the plague. The fleas, hidden in clothing, baggage, or on animals, were the true silent hitchhikers, jumping off at every stop, ready to infect new hosts. You might carefully wash your hands with river water, a dubious form of hygiene, as we've discussed, but the flea lurking in your travel cloak wouldn't care. The economic impact of this travel trouble was immense. Trade routes, the very arteries of the medieval economy, were severely disrupted. Merchants were hesitant to travel, goods lay unsold, and the flow of vital supplies dwindled. This not only created shortages and economic hardship, but also limited access to necessities that might have helped people survive, like food from more fertile regions. The world, already grappling with a pandemic, was also plunging into a widespread economic crisis, proving that sometimes, even in the darkest times, the market will find a way to make things worse. As the Black Death continued its relentless march across Europe, the unimaginable loss of life began to fundamentally reshape society, particularly in terms of work and wages. You would have witnessed a dramatic, almost revolutionary shift in the economic landscape, turning the old feudal order on its head. Before the plague, Europe was characterized by a massive surplus of labor. The vast majority of the population were peasants tied to the land, working for lords who held immense power. Wages were low, and rights were few. You, as a common laborer, had little bargaining power. Your options were limited: toil on the land or starve. It was a pretty simple, if brutal, economic equation. Then came the plague, and with it, a demographic catastrophe. Imagine watching half, or even more, of your village, your town, disappear. Fields lay fallow because there was no one left to work them. Workshops stood silent because the artisans were dead. Houses were empty. This wasn't just a shortage, it was a devastating vacuum. Suddenly, the entire supply-demand curve for labor flipped. The demand remained: there was still land to till, goods to produce, services to be rendered, but the supply of available workers had plummeted. This created an unprecedented opportunity for those who survived. For the first time in generations, you, a common laborer, had leverage. Lords and masters, desperate to find people to work their lands and run their businesses, were forced to offer higher wages, better conditions, and even, in some cases, greater freedoms. You might hear stories of peasants abandoning their traditional manners to seek work elsewhere, where pay was better. This newfound mobility was a radical departure from the rigid social structures of the past. Historians still argue about the precise impact of the plague on the long-term decline of feudalism, but its role in empowering the common laborer is undeniable. Of course, the elite didn't take kindly to this shift. Governments and landowners tried to suppress wages and control peasant movements through legislation, like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels. But these laws were largely ineffective. It's hard to enforce an arbitrary wage when literally everyone is dying and there's no one left to enforce it anyway. You might have seen your own neighbors openly defying these laws, knowing that desperation would eventually win out. It was a quiet rebellion, fought not with swords, but with the stark reality of empty fields and idle looms. For skilled artisans, the change was even more pronounced. If you were a master craftsman, a blacksmith, a baker, a carpenter, your skills became incredibly valuable. Apprenticeships, which used to be long and arduous, might be shortened as masters desperately needed new hands. You might find yourself inundated with work, earning more in a week than you previously did in a month. This led to a surprising economic boom for some survivors, a grim silver lining to the mass death. Imagine the bizarre experience of inheriting a substantial sum or a thriving business simply because everyone else in your family or your guild had succumbed. It's a bit like winning the morbid lottery, where the jackpot is just not dying. This shift wasn't without its challenges, though. While wages rose, so too did the price of goods in some areas due to disrupted supply chains and a general sense of instability. And for the wealthy, the cost of labor became a significant burden, leading to resentment and further social stratification. The very fabric of medieval society, once seemingly immutable, was being stretched and torn, forcing an unprecedented renegotiation of power between those who owned the land and those who worked it. The world you woke up to after the plague was profoundly different from the one that existed before. As the waves of plague eventually subsided, leaving behind a scarred and vastly depopulated continent, the survivors faced the monumental task of rebuilding society. This wasn't just about clearing away the dead and replanting crops. It was about fundamentally reshaping a world that had been irrevocably altered. You, as one of the fortunate few, would have been at the heart of this arduous, yet strangely transformative process. The immediate aftermath was one of eerie silence and immense practical challenges. Entire villages lay abandoned, their fields overgrown. Cities, once vibrant, were quiet, their markets barren. The sheer number of deaths meant a critical shortage of labor, as we've discussed, but also a breakdown of governance, law, and order in many places. Imagine returning to your farm, only to find your tools rusted, your animals scattered, and your neighbors' homes empty. It was a blank slate, but one written in tragedy. However, from this devastation emerged surprising opportunities and innovations. The extreme labor shortage meant that land, which was once the ultimate measure of wealth and power, became relatively cheap and abundant. If you were a surviving peasant, you might now have a chance to lease or even own land, something almost unthinkable before the plague. This led to a rise in a class of independent farmers, less beholden to the old feudal lords. It was a slow, grinding process, but one that laid some of the groundwork for future social mobility. Historians still argue about the precise extent to which these changes directly led to the eventual decline of serfdom, but the plague certainly accelerated the process. For those in urban areas, the depopulation meant less crowding, which, ironically, could lead to a temporary improvement in sanitation for the survivors, simply because there were fewer people generating waste. Guilds, which had strictly controlled trades, found themselves desperate for new members, sometimes lowering their stringent requirements. This meant that if you had a knack for a craft, you might find yourself apprenticed or even become a master much faster than before. Think of it as a morbid fast-track program. The demand for goods and services, while initially low, eventually resurfaced, and with fewer people to produce them. those who could often commanded better prices. There was also a significant psychological shift. The experience of surviving such a catastrophic event often led to a questioning of established norms and authorities, both secular and religious. Why had God allowed such suffering? Why had the old systems failed to protect anyone? This introspection fueled new intellectual currents, contributing to the shift in worldview that would eventually usher in the Renaissance. You might have seen more people questioning the church, or turning to more personal forms of spirituality, or perhaps simply throwing caution to the wind and living for the moment given the fragility of life. The rebuilding wasn't just about economics. It was about cultural and social renewal. Communities, though thinned, often developed stronger bonds of mutual aid, relying on each other in the absence of traditional support structures. New charitable institutions might emerge, founded by survivors seeking to honor the dead or protect the living. While the memory of the plague remained a dark shadow, life, with its inherent resilience, began to assert itself. Children were born, marriages took place, and the sounds of work, laughter, and daily life slowly returned, forever tinged with a quiet understanding of just how fragile existence truly was. Having glimpsed the terror and transformation wrought by the Black Death, it's sobering to consider that it wasn't a one-off event. History, sadly, is replete with future plagues and epidemics, offering stark lessons that humanity often seems to forget. You might think, well, that was medieval times, we're smarter now. And while we have antibiotics and advanced medicine, the fundamental challenges of disease, transmission, and human behavior echo through the centuries. The Yersinia pestis bacterium, the same villain behind the Black Death, didn't just vanish after the 14th century. It continued to resurface in subsequent waves, though generally with lower mortality rates. Europe experienced significant plague outbreaks in the 17th century, notably the Great Plague of London in 1665 to 1666, and later the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720 to 1722. Each time, despite some accumulated knowledge, the responses often mirrored the panic, the quarantines, and the desperate remedies of the earlier era. You would see similar patterns: flight from cities, economic disruption, and a heavy toll on human life. It's like watching a bad sequel to a terrifying movie, where the plot twists are familiar, but the horror is still very real. Beyond the plague, other diseases have repeatedly ravaged human populations. Consider smallpox, a viral disease that was endemic for millennia, killing millions and leaving survivors scarred or blind. It wasn't until the development of vaccines in the late 18th century that humanity finally gained a true weapon against it. Then there's cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, which caused devastating pandemics throughout the 19th century, particularly in rapidly industrializing cities with poor sanitation. The fight against cholera, led by figures like John Snow, who famously traced an outbreak to a contaminated water pump in London, was a crucial step in understanding disease transmission, moving beyond the miasma theory to germ theory. Historians still argue about whether scientific understanding progressed fast enough to truly save lives in these later outbreaks, or if societal improvements played a larger role. The lessons from these recurring outbreaks are glaringly simple, yet often unlearned. Sanitation, understanding disease vectors, rapid identification of outbreaks, and coordinated public health responses are crucial. Yet, even in later centuries, the initial reaction was often fear, blame, and ineffective remedies. You might read about people still clutching pomanders, or doctors still using bloodletting long after the medieval era, a testament to how deeply ingrained certain beliefs can be. It's a reminder that knowledge, even when available, doesn't always immediately translate into widespread, effective action. Even in the 20th century, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic demonstrated how a novel virus could sweep across the globe, killing tens of millions, far exceeding the death toll of World War I. This wasn't a medieval plague. It was a modern pandemic, occurring in an age of relatively advanced medicine rapid global travel, and mass communication. Yet, social distancing, mask wearing, and overwhelmed healthcare systems were common themes, echoing the strategies or lack thereof from centuries prior. You'd see cities closed down, public gatherings banned, and a scramble for cures that weren't yet available. It's a sobering thought. Despite all our progress, some of the basic responses to a widespread respiratory illness remain strikingly similar to those of the 14th century. The past is not just prologue. Sometimes it's a recurring nightmare. Bringing our journey closer to home, the lessons from the Black Death and subsequent historical plagues find surprising and often unsettling modern echoes in how we resist new threats. You might think that with all our scientific advancements, we're entirely immune to the vulnerabilities of the past. But while we've certainly got better tools, human nature and some fundamental challenges remain remarkably consistent. Consider the recent past, the global events that have dominated headlines and disrupted lives within your own memory. When a new virus emerges, the initial reactions often mirror those from centuries ago, albeit with a digital twist. There's the initial fear, the scramble for information often conflicting in the desperate search for solutions. You see people retreating into their homes, practicing forms of self-isolation. Cities go into lockdowns, echoing the medieval quarantines, albeit with grocery delivery services and streaming entertainment instead of bricked-up doors. The concept of social distancing, wearing masks, and avoiding large gatherings are direct parallels to the crude but instinctively logical precautions taken by people in the 14th century, even if they didn't understand the microscopic reasons why. Historians still argue whether the speed of modern information or misinformation contributes more to collective panic or rational response during a pandemic. The economic fallout, too, has chilling similarities. Supply chains are disrupted, businesses struggle, and the labor market shifts, albeit perhaps not as dramatically as after the Black Death. You might have seen certain industries collapse while others boomed, or witnessed a sudden demand for new skills, much like the post-plague demand for skilled artisans. The globalized world, while offering incredible efficiencies, also means that a pathogen can spread from a remote village to every major continent in days, not months or years, making early containment incredibly challenging. It's like having a hyper-fast medieval plague delivered directly to your doorstep by express airmail. Public health responses, while backed by science, still face familiar hurdles. The tension between individual liberty and collective good, the challenges of enforcing public health mandates, and the spread of misinformation or outright denial are constants. You might hear debates about vaccine mandates or mask requirements that sound remarkably similar in their underlying arguments to medieval discussions about the efficacy of a physician's remedies versus divine will. The human tendency to seek blame, to look for simple answers to complex problems, also persists. While we no longer blame Jews for poisoning wells, the search for scapegoats or the rapid spread of conspiracy theories via social media serve as modern analogs to the superstitious fears of old. Even the simple act of hand washing, now a fundamental cornerstone of hygiene, has historical roots. While medieval people lacked soap and running water, the general understanding that cleanliness could prevent illness slowly developed over centuries, even before germ theory. Now, you're reminded constantly to wash your hands, a testament to a hard-won public health lesson. The understanding of vectors, too, has evolved. From rat fleas in the past to airborne droplets or contaminated surfaces today, the principle of interrupting transmission remains central. Ultimately, while you're not rubbing live chickens on your buboes, hopefully, the underlying human experience of fear, resilience, and adaptation in the face of a terrifying disease outbreak has deep historical resonance. We have better science, better infrastructure, and certainly better sanitation. But the core challenge how societies respond to a rapidly spreading, invisible threat continues to draw lessons, both learned and unlearned, from the plagues of the past. It serves as a quiet reminder that beneath our technological veneer, we're still grappling with some very ancient fears. So, After journeying through the gritty realities of the Black Death and peering into the recurring patterns of historical plagues, we arrive at the ultimate question. How would your personal chances of survival stack up? If you were, by some bizarre twist of fate, thrust into that 14th century nightmare, what would your odds truly be? It's a chilling thought experiment, blending historical context with a whisper of modern perspective. First, let's be brutally honest. Your chances wouldn't be great. The sheer mortality rate of the Black Death was staggering, estimated at 30 to 50% of Europe's population, and in some areas, far higher. Those numbers aren't just statistics. They represent millions of individual lives, each a person like you. You'd be facing a disease for which there was no known cure, no antibiotics, and no scientific understanding of its cause or transmission. Your immune system, even if robust by modern standards, would be battling an enemy it had never encountered, a silent assassin delivered by a flea bite. You might be the healthiest, most resilient person in your village, but if an infected flea found its way to you, your prospects would dim considerably. It's a pretty effective way to level the playing field. Actually, turns out the plague doesn't care if you're rich or poor. However, let's inject a tiny bit of modern insight. Knowing what you know now, even stripped of modern medicine, could you game the system? You'd understand that fleas are the primary vectors, so you might try to keep your living space meticulously clean as much as possible in a medieval setting. You'd obsessively check yourself for bites, knowing that a tiny itch could be a death knell. You'd avoid rats like, well, the plague. You might try to air out your bedding regularly, perhaps even douse yourself in rudimentary insect repellents if you could concoct them from strong-smelling herbs, though their effectiveness would be minimal. You'd also know that human-to-human transmission, particularly of the more deadly pneumonic form, happens through respiratory droplets. So, you might instinctively practice extreme social distancing, avoiding crowds, covering your mouth and nose around others, even if only with a dirty rag, and fleeing infected areas with far more urgency than the average medieval peasant who believed in miasma. If you had the foresight, you might try to self-quarantine before symptoms appeared, something most people only did once they were already clearly ill. Historians still argue whether the knowledge of a disease's true transmission method is more powerful than the societal structures in place to prevent its spread. But here's the grim reality check. Even with your enlightened knowledge, you'd be fighting against overwhelming odds. The pervasive lack of sanitation, the contaminated water, the chronic malnutrition that weakened immune systems, and the sheer density of fleas in the environment would be almost insurmountable obstacles. You might survive the initial wave of plague in your community, only to succumb to starvation because the farmers had all died or fall victim to a subsequent, smaller outbreak that flares up from lingering flea populations. Ultimately, your survival would largely come down to luck. The luck of not being bitten by an infected flea. The luck of having a naturally stronger immune response than your neighbors. The luck of living in a sparsely populated, isolated area that the plague bypassed entirely. Your survival, if it happened, wouldn't be a testament to your superior intellect or even extraordinary resilience in a medieval context, but largely to a series of fortuitous circumstances. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That for all our modern advances, sometimes, in the face of nature's raw power, we are all just tiny, vulnerable creatures, hoping the dice roll in our favor. The finality of the night is settling in, a gentle hush falling over the world. The historical anxieties we've explored, the fears of unseen threats, and the resilience of the human spirit are fading now, dissolving into the quiet comfort of your own safe space. Let the echoes of those distant struggles recede, knowing that you live in a different time, with different knowledge, and yes, with much, much better hygiene. Feel the soft hum of your surroundings, the warmth of your bed, and the steady rhythm of your breath. The stories of the past are lessons, not looming shadows. They remind us of how far we've come, and perhaps how much we still have to appreciate in the quiet security of our present. Let these thoughts drift like clouds across a darkening sky, carrying away any lingering unease. The history books can close for now, and the rest, is simply peace.